So what did you think of what that lady had to say in the video then? Did you think it was as simple as she said? I'm not really that sure about that, but I did agree when she said we all know when it's missing. I think that is so true. We may not know what to do, but we all know when something's wrong. She talked about the example of mixed messages between what we say and what actually happens, for example, in the trucking company. And she also talked about the fact that people aren't doing things necessarily because they're prejudiced. Sometimes it's just unconscious bias from our upbringing, the messages that we've received, or the experiences we've had from previous bosses, like when a daughter thought there was no white doctors. We have to be careful about that and recognise that people have unconscious bias, or we may have unconscious bias. So from that video, what actions can we build on the actions we already had? So from that video, I think she brought in the reducing unconscious bias, or at least we need to be aware of it. Another point she got across was about figuring out our message and make sure we know what the message is that we're putting out. She also talked about don't be judgmental. Difference is something we should appreciate, and we shouldn't jump to conclusions. And the final one, which is sort of an old adage that we'll all remember, is about following the golden rule, which was treat others how we wish to be treated ourselves. And that's so true. She also went on to say that we should include these in every single workplace decision we make. And above all, she said that mistakes around equality, diversity and inclusion are avoidable. I think if we consider all these things in these actions, then yes, these things are avoidable. So we've seen a couple of different approaches there in a couple of videos, and from that we've built a list of practical things, actions or factors that we can use to make a difference and to embed practical diversity into our organisation or our team. Because if we don't, we can face consequences. What could those consequences be? Well, the Equality and Human Rights Commission are the regulator for the Equalities Act 2010, and they have the powers that enable it to enforce the law. They also have powers to help individuals with their legal cases, take regulatory actions against areas where the law's been broken, and they have formal enforcement powers, which may include things such as inquiries, conducting investigations, issuing of unlawful act notices, enforcing agreements and completing assessments, and also issuing compliance notices. But ultimately, the worst case scenario, there can be financial penalties awarded from employment tribunals. And what I feel is even more damaging for organisations, though, is the publicity that comes, the impact on customers, employees and potential employees through recruitment, and a global business reputation. If the organisation is seen to be failing to offer equal opportunities, is very, very damaging. And it can also be damaging for the individual, because if you're involved in a case and you're not following procedures, or you've not taken actions to ensure that you conform to legislation, you could also face the sack or further action. Now we've looked at the building blocks for practical actions and the consequences if we do not ensure that equality, diversity and inclusion are embedded in the workplace. We need to think about how we're going to make these work, and for these to work we need a culture of acceptance. That's probably going to be built onto or within that organisational culture that we examined in the last session, and built on British values. We need to ensure that there's some key characteristics that are covered, and they're all areas that leaders can have a major impact on. The first is openness. We need honesty, people feeling valued so they're prepared to speak out or speak up. They need to have a clear and transparent reporting process so that they feel their opinions will be valued. There needs to be awareness around the promotion of equality, diversity and inclusion. That's policy, a clear vision and clear process and procedures that all meet up and reinforce that the policy is there and that it's in place. There needs to be values, and they need to be promoted and backed up with actions. And they're going to cover those British values: reinforcing democracy, individual liberty, rule of law, and respect and tolerance. And those actions need to come from the top down. And then there need to be role models, and that's where the leadership comes in. Leaders that people can look up to, and whose behaviours and actions mirror all those other areas, mirror the values, the vision and the policies and the procedures that are in place within the organisation. And that's about showing leadership. Right then, so let's start to round up what we actually have to do, where all these things we've been talking about fit together. When the Equality Act became law in October 2010, it replaced a number of previous acts, legislation such as the Race Relations Act, Disability Act, and it was bringing them all together to ensure clarity and consistency in what employers and employees needed to do. And they focused on two key areas. The first one was to comply with the law. So that's employees and employers were to comply with the law. And the second, it also stated that it needed to make their workplaces a fair environment. And they're the areas we've really been focusing on. So the inference there is that just complying with the law is not good enough on its own. You also need to show the actions, behaviours, traits that are giving people equal opportunities, removing barriers, valuing them as individuals, and protecting them in everything we do within the business. And that is what we were talking about before, practical diversity. So on the next slide, we'll just have a recap of what we've covered. To recap then, over this session, we've looked at what equality, diversity and inclusion is about in the workplace. And in doing that, we've looked at the difference between equality, diversity and inclusion so that we're clear. We've examined the responsibilities of an organisation under equality legislation and highlighted the consequences of not adhering to that legislation. We've looked in detail at what leaders can do to embed quality and diversity inclusion into workplace practices and how they can promote a culture where the actual and potential discrimination is challenged by our actions, creating that culture of acceptance and getting employees to come to our workforce from the website Rent a Minority. Only a joke. I hope that session's been good, and on the next thing we'll just look at what we need to do for actions before moving on to the final stage. So now I need you to go away and complete activity 6, which is a Word document that you can download. You need to consider your action behaviours when in the given scenario. What actions would you take and why in the scenario that's given? Consider how you would motivate your staff and what techniques you might use, and consider what leadership style you would use. Once that's complete and uploaded, then you can move on to the next session, session 5, which is your overall unit assignment from ILM.